Hi, my name is Bryson Sylliboy. I'm Mi'kmaq. I'm from Sagavanagati First Nations in Nova Scotia. I'm Two-Spirit, and I identify as gay and queer as well.
I'm John R. Sylliboy, and I'm from Eskasoni and Millbrook both. I'm the executive director of the Wabanaki Two-Spirit Alliance and also the co-founder with Duma Young. Well, that's an evolving term, even from my perspective, which bases it on a Ulnuwe worldview around what Two-Spirit is. I did my master's conceptualizing what Two-Spirit is and published a couple of papers related to it. There's various degrees of how Two-Spirit's explained. In my master's, I had explained that it was an umbrella term that's being used to identify Indigenous people who do not fit that binary of identity based on gender, and sexuality encompasses anything that has to do with us LGBTQIA plus terms. And it's been used as a pan-Indigenous term at this point across Turtle Island, but it's also expanded outside of Turtle Island into other areas internationally.
Somebody who is, closely tied to their Indigenous culture. Like for us Mi'kmaq, we're still in the process of reclaiming it. Our traditional Two-Spirit like customs and practices were wiped out through colonization. So we're in the midst of revitalization and resurgence in practices being Two-Spirit. So we don't really know what our specific practices were. So we kind of are consulting with other nations throughout North America and, kind of trying to find our foot.
So to be Two-Spirited, it identifies our connection to our historical, cultural aspects of who we are. That queer people and gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, and the other, acronym terms don't have that specific understanding of their identity. We do as Two-Spirit people, because it's very important that we understand that our historical, our ancestral, and our spiritual connections toward our identity as Two-Spirit people is important.
Because it shows your connection to your culture and your connection to the land, to your heritage, and like it just gives you a sense of community, like within an Indigenous space, and something that's meant for us and us alone.
Well, it's very important because that's the term that we as an Ulnug have adopted as an Indigenous term to, instead of using any of the English terms, we can use Two-Spirit's still an English term, but at least it's in reference to Indigenous people specifically. So that's important for one. The reason why that's important is that when we do seek services, for example, gender-affirming care for people who are Two-Spirit specific, then we would know better numbers and how to advocate for those better numbers so that those resources can be aligned and assigned to our communities and to our organizations that advocate for this. That's why it's very important that we have Two-Spirit there.
Like decolonization is different for everybody. What works for me doesn't necessarily work for somebody else, but I know like it has to involve Two-Spirit people because our cultures have been decimated by colonization, and the church and residential schools, Indian day schools, every aspect of that. Queer people have existed, for time immemorial, and since colonization happened, we kind of got sidelined and thrown to the goals. I think decolonization really does have to like center Two-Spirit people in it because we were vital to a lot of tribes, a lot of nations.
You have to remember that a lot of these narratives and historical documents, and even documents that were taken by historians or people that were doing, census on Indigenous people. It was their perspectives, it was their narratives and their interpretations of who we were, not necessarily capturing the true essence of who we are or who we were and who we are today. So we have to decolonize and separate what the narratives are from the colonists, the colonizers, and the people that had narrated all these Jesuits' relations, our policies, and their observations. And we have to stick true to how we are as Ulnu and go back to the source of who we are based on our principles and values. And I sincerely think that that is a way that I'm decolonizing and indigenizing and Ulnuadu how we're thinking based on that Two-Spirit concept. We know that gender identity right now is a complex issue with the 713 policy, for example, in New Brunswick. That includes Two-Spirit people, but we're saying you have no right to tell us how we can self-identify as Ulnu. That's our inherent and Aboriginal and Indigenous and Ulnu right. So I argue that that's how we have to stick true to who we are. At the same time, on the other side, we know that's a stance of self-determination. That's a stance of recognizing our identity as who we are. That's like a human rights stance as well. What really is about identifying Two-Spirit as well is understanding that we need to bring our ceremonies back into practice for Two-Spirit people who have been pushed aside and pushed outside of the circles because, traditionalists say, that's a European concept. That's not our traditional way. When in fact, traditionalists centuries back had also been impacted by colonial rules and Christian rules who said, you have to wear, this, you have to act this way because you're a boy, you got to act this way because you're a girl. Those were colonial constructs impacting our, previous cultural beliefs. And then they were readopted by our own communities and then retaught back to the new generations as traditional. I think people were just allowed to do and be and celebrate your identity how you are. I really believe that. I think the influence of colonial heteronormative practices came into law. And people who were revered as Two-Spirited and because they were healers and shamans and medicine people, they were the first ones attacked because they were spiritual guides. And so the religious movements across Canada during those colonial periods would have went after those religious people first, those spiritual people first. And if they were Two-Spirited, with all the more reason because they didn't also represent the gender or the sexuality, not only the spirituality components.
I think in order for us to decolonize queer spaces, we have to look at queer spaces themselves and the bigotry that's accepted in queer spaces. Queer people, they're marginalized, but that doesn't absolve them from racism, transphobia, sexism, any kind of bigotry. And that is often overlooked in queer spaces because, we kind of use our queerness as a shield, that automatically absolves us from our bigotry or protects us. It always comes down to centering BIPOC voices in queer spaces and making sure that it is known that this space is truly for everybody. Have a place to be able to smudge, have a place where you can pray, have a place that's accessible as well, because I find a lot of queer places aren't accessible. So we got to think about our community. We're not just able-bodied people.
Queer organizations that are outside of our Indigenous communities, we went to them as well and said, listen, you really have to up your game when it comes to Two-Spirit content and Two-Spirit spaces. So we started advocating building spaces in Pride organizations. We started building spaces literally, let's say in Pride Halifax, we put up a teepee right at the garrison grounds so that Indigenous people would be identified there. They would see them there as Two-Spirit people. And that made a great impact, not only for the non-Indigenous people outside of our community, but they also said, we have to celebrate Two-Spirit people as well. They are part of our community, not just GSAs. We need policies. We need celebrate ceremonial aspects. We need powwows in communities. We need spaces in schools. We need people to be celebrated in their own identity wherever we can. And then we want policies to be inclusive of our people, right? Which means housing, education, health, gender affirming care, for example. It's not a matter of GSA anymore. It's a matter of people's well-being, and to a certain degree, a matter of life and death for some people. Join us. We want Two-Spirit people to join us with the Wabanaki Two-Spirit Alliance, for example. Join us in schools, join us in powwows, join us in pride activities, join us when we're advocating for all our rights, and to build curricula, let's say in MK schools. We want to build social services for Two-Spirit people in health centers. We want people to just be included everywhere, but we need them to feel that they can trust us. We'll protect you as much as we can. We'll advocate for you for sure, and we're doing that anyway. But we want to hear from people and celebrate their identity in the best way possible when we do have gatherings. Yeah, that's the message is we hear you, we're here for you, and we want you to be more involved with us if you can.
Just be yourself. You're who you're supposed to be. You know, like it took me a long time to figure out who I was. I grew up in the 80s and 90s where, you know, being queer, gay was not acceptable. And I look at today's youth and, you know, like they have the whole world at their hands, and there's so much information out there and so much resources out there for them. And it's not going to matter what your parents say. It's not going to matter what your friends say. It's not going to matter what anybody says. You know, like you're who you're meant to be, and you will find your community, no matter where you're from. You will find a community where you belong, and you will be accepted.